Staten Island, New York. Skeely's Tavern on Richmond Terrace. Friday night, June 2nd, 1973. A working-class bar that had been serving drinks to dock workers and longshoremen and their wives and girlfriends for 30 years. Where the atmosphere on Friday nights was loud and smoky and alive with the particular energy that characterized Staten Island bars when the working week was finished, and people were drinking to forget whatever they'd endured during the 5 days that had led to this moment. The jukebox played music that was too loud for comfortable conversation, which suited most patrons because conversation wasn't really why they came. They came to drink and to be around other people who were drinking, and to feel the particular warmth that alcohol and company provided after weeks of labor that paid enough to survive, but not enough to feel like survival was worth celebrating. The bar was crowded, approximately 60 people, filling the space that comfortably held maybe 40 bodies pressed against the bar 3 deep on Friday nights like this. Conversations overlapping and competing with the jukebox and with the particular noise that crowded drinking establishments generated. The clinking of glasses, the scraping of chairs, the occasional burst of laughter that broke through the general din like a firecracker going off in a room full of people who were almost but not quite expecting it. The kind of bar where nobody paid much attention to who was coming or going, where new faces weren't unusual enough to draw comment, where the business of drinking was conducted with enough focus and enough noise that individual conversations were essentially private, despite the crowd. James McBratney sat at a corner table, 43 years old, a man who'd built modest criminal reputation in Staten Island through combination of muscle and audacity, someone who operated in the spaces between organized crime families where independent operators could make money without paying tribute to anyone, who'd survived in those dangerous margins through willingness to take risks that more cautious criminals avoided, and through the particular kind of luck that some criminals possessed and that others spent their entire careers envying. McBratney was drinking bourbon, had been drinking bourbon for approximately 3 hours, was in the comfortable haze that comes from sustained alcohol consumption on an empty stomach, the kind of drinking that made the world softer and louder simultaneously, that made problems seem manageable and dangers seem distant. McBratney was drinking because he'd had a good week, a very good week, a week that had generated more money than his normal criminal activities typically produced in a month, money that had come from a source that McBratney viewed as extraordinary luck, but that was actually the specific kind of luck that carried consequences so severe that no amount of bourbon could make them manageable. 2 weeks earlier, James McBratney had kidnapped Anthony Canaluzzo, a young man who was nephew to Carlo Gambino, the boss of the Gambino crime family, and arguably the most powerful organized crime figure in America, despite being 73 years old, despite suffering from heart problems that limited his physical capability, despite operating through lieutenants rather than through personal presence, because his health no longer permitted the kind of active involvement that had characterized his earlier decades as family boss. Carlo Gambino was old, but was still absolutely the most feared man in New York's criminal world, was still someone whose authority was absolute and whose anger was lethal, was still someone whose family members were protected by organizational power that exceeded anything any single criminal or any small group of criminals could challenge. McBratney had kidnapped Canaluzzo through a combination of opportunism and stupidity, had seen opportunity to make quick money by holding the young man for ransom, had apparently either not known or not cared about the relationship between Canaluzzo and Carlo Gambino, had assumed that the ransom would be paid quietly, and that the matter would be resolved through financial transaction rather than through the kind of violent response that kidnapping a Gambino family member would inevitably trigger. The ransom had been paid, $175,000 in cash, delivered according to McBratney's instructions, without police involvement because the Gambino family handled such matters internally rather than through authorities who couldn't be trusted to resolve situations without creating complications that might expose organized crime's involvement. Canaluzzo had been released, unharmed physically, though traumatized by his experience, returned to his family with the kind of relief that only kidnapping victims and their families understood. The particular combination of gratitude for survival and fury at the violation that kidnapping created. But Carlo Gambino had not paid the ransom and forgotten. Carlo Gambino had paid the ransom because paying was the fastest way to ensure Canaluzzo's safety, because the priority was getting his nephew back alive, and the fastest way to accomplish that was giving McBratney what he wanted. But after Canaluzzo was safe, after the money had been delivered and the young man had been released, Carlo Gambino made a decision that was characteristic of how he'd operated for decades. The decision that James McBratney would die, that his death would be ordered as payment for the insult and the violation that kidnapping a Gambino family member represented, that the death needed to happen quickly and decisively and in ways that sent message about what happened to people who took things that belonged to Carlo Gambino. The death order was given on a Monday, 2 days after Canaluzzo was released, during a meeting at the Ravenite Social Club, where Carlo Gambino was present despite his health problems, where he sat in a chair that was specifically positioned to accommodate his breathing difficulties, where he spoke quietly but with absolute authority about what needed to happen and how it needed to happen and who was going to do it. Carlo Gambino didn't pick the killer himself. He directed Angelo Ruggiero, one of his trusted lieutenants, to identify someone suitable for the job, someone who would carry out the hit efficiently, who would demonstrate capability and loyalty, who would prove himself through willingness to do the dirty work that organized crime required when insults demanded blood. Ruggiero considered several options, thought about the available soldiers and associates, and eventually identified a 33-year-old soldier named John Gotti, who was hungry for advancement within the family, who'd proven himself capable through previous criminal activity, who was willing to take risks that other soldiers might refuse, because Gotti understood that advancement in mob hierarchy required willingness to do whatever was necessary to demonstrate loyalty and capability. John Gotti received the assignment on Wednesday afternoon, June 1st, 1973, in a conversation with Angelo Ruggiero that was brief and businesslike, that delivered information and instructions without unnecessary emotional coloring, that treated the upcoming murder with the same professional tone that legitimate business meetings were conducted with regarding difficult but necessary corporate decisions. Carlo wants McBratney dead, Ruggiero told Gotti, his voice showing no particular emotion about the statement, no moral weight or dramatic significance, just fact delivered efficiently. He kidnapped Carlo's nephew. He took money for the nephew. Now he needs to pay for taking the nephew in the first place. You're going to handle it. Take 2 guys with you, reliable guys, people who can keep their mouths shut afterward. Find McBratney. Kill him. Clean. Quick. No complications. Gotti nodded, understanding that this was opportunity, not just to complete an assignment, but to prove himself to Carlo Gambino personally, to demonstrate that he was the kind of soldier who could be trusted with serious work, who could execute a hit without creating the kind of complications that less capable criminals created when they were given this kind of responsibility. This hit could establish Gotti's reputation within the family in ways that other criminal activities couldn't, could put him on a trajectory toward positions of greater authority and greater income. Gotti spent the remainder of Wednesday and all of Thursday identifying McBratney's patterns, where he drank, when he drank, who he drank with, what his routine looked like on any given evening. The intelligence was gathered through associates who frequented the same Staten Island establishments as McBratney, who could observe his movements without attracting attention, who provided information that allowed Gotti to plan the hit with enough precision to identify when and where McBratney would be most vulnerable. By Thursday evening, Gotti had identified Skeely's Tavern on Richmond Terrace as the most likely location for Friday night. McBratney was a regular on Friday evenings, typically arrived around 7 p.m., stayed until closing or until he was drunk enough that going home became necessary, sat at the corner table near the back where he could see the door, but where the noise of the bar provided cover for conversations that might be sensitive. Gotti selected his 2 companions carefully. Anthony Caiola, 28 years old, a stocky man who'd proven himself reliable in previous criminal operations, who could follow orders without questioning them, and who could handle physical confrontation without losing composure. Nicholas Mastropieri, 31 years old, another soldier who demonstrated loyalty through previous assignments, who carried himself with the particular calm that suggested he'd been in dangerous situations before and had learned to manage his fear effectively. The plan was straightforward. Enter the bar, approach McBratney, take him outside under some pretext, kill him in a location where the noise and the darkness and the absence of witnesses would prevent complications. Professional. Clean. Exactly what Ruggiero had instructed. But plans in criminal enterprise, like plans in warfare, rarely survived contact with reality. And the reality that Gotti, Caiola, and Mastropieri encountered when they entered Skeely's Tavern at approximately 9:30 p.m. Friday evening was fundamentally different from what they'd anticipated, was chaotic and loud and crowded in ways that made the clean professional hit they'd planned essentially impossible to execute. The bar was packed beyond capacity. The crowd was loud, was drunk, was paying attention to each other and to the jukebox and to their drinks and to the particular social dynamics of Friday night drinking that dominated everyone's attention. Getting McBratney outside quietly, convincing him to leave the bar without creating scene, accomplishing the preliminary step of relocating the target to a more suitable location for execution. All of that was harder than it should have been because McBratney was drunk and loud and comfortable, and had no reason to leave his corner table for any reason except bathroom or closing time. Gotti approached McBratney's table at 9:47 p.m., his approach casual enough to avoid triggering alarm, his demeanor friendly rather than threatening, his opening words designed to create impression that this was social encounter rather than the beginning of something lethal. "McBratney," Gotti said, leaning down so his voice could be heard over the bar noise, his expression showing nothing except casual friendliness that a stranger might show when recognizing someone they'd seen before. "I need to talk to you about something. Outside. Won't take long." McBratney looked up at Gotti with the unfocused attention of someone who'd been drinking steadily for 3 hours, his eyes slightly glazed, his reaction time delayed by bourbon, his assessment of this stranger impaired by alcohol in ways that made him less cautious than he would have been sober. McBratney didn't recognize Gotti, had never met him, had no reason to connect this young man from Queens to Carlo Gambino, or to the Gambino family, or to the order that had been placed for McBratney's death. "Who are you?" McBratney asked, his voice carrying the particular irritation that drunk people felt when their drinking was interrupted by someone they didn't know, the reflexive defensiveness that came from being approached in your own space by a stranger who seemed to want something. "Friend of a friend," Gotti said, maintaining the casual tone. "Somebody asked me to deliver a message, but it's not something I want to discuss in here. Too many ears. Come outside for 2 minutes. We talk. Then I leave, and you go back to your bourbon." McBratney looked at Gotti for a long moment, processing the request through the haze of alcohol, calculating whether going outside with this stranger was worth the effort of standing up and moving through the crowd to the door. A sober McBratney might have been more suspicious, might have asked more questions, might have sensed that something about this encounter didn't feel right. But drunk McBratney was comfortable, was enjoying his Friday evening, and the idea of a brief conversation outside, followed by return to his drink, seemed perfectly reasonable. "Why can't you just say it here?" McBratney asked, gesturing around the bar. "Nobody's listening to anything in this noise." Gotti's patience was running thin. The longer this conversation continued in the crowded bar, the more people noticed Gotti standing at McBratney's table, the more complicated the situation became. The plan had been to get McBratney outside quietly, quickly, without attracting attention. That plan was failing because McBratney was too drunk and too comfortable to cooperate with someone he didn't know who was asking him to move. "It's about money," Gotti said, lowering his voice further, creating impression of confidentiality. "A lot of money. The kind of conversation you don't want happening in a bar full of drunks who might overhear." That got McBratney's attention. Money was always an effective motivation, was something that made drunk people suddenly more alert, more willing to cooperate with requests they might otherwise refuse. McBratney pushed back from his table, stood up with the exaggerated care of someone navigating unsteady legs, and began moving toward the door. But something changed in McBratney's expression as he moved, as the bourbon haze cleared slightly with the physical activity of standing and walking. Something in his face suggested he was reassessing the situation, that something about this encounter was triggering alarm that the alcohol had initially suppressed, that McBratney was beginning to feel the particular unease that criminals sometimes felt when situations didn't feel quite right, when the energy of an interaction carried subtle wrongness that couldn't be articulated but couldn't be ignored. McBratney stopped walking, turned back toward his table, looked at Gotti with an expression that had shifted from drunk compliance to suspicious attention, that showed he was suddenly questioning why he was walking toward the door with a stranger he didn't know, why he was trusting someone who'd appeared out of nowhere with vague promises about money, why this situation felt different from normal Friday evening interactions. "Actually," McBratney said, his voice now carrying edge that hadn't been present moments earlier, "I think I'll stay right here. Whatever you want to talk about, you can talk about it in the bar, or you can come back another time when I'm more interested in hearing it." McBratney turned and started walking back toward his table, dismissing Gotti with body language that made it clear the conversation was over, that he wasn't going outside, that whatever Gotti's approach had been designed to accomplish had failed. Gotti looked at Caiola and Mastropieri, who were positioned near the bar and who'd been watching the interaction, who understood immediately that the plan had failed, that McBratney wasn't going to leave the tavern voluntarily, that they were now in a situation where the professional clean hit they'd planned was no longer possible, and where they needed to decide in the next few seconds whether to abandon the assignment or to execute it here in this crowded bar in front of approximately 60 witnesses in ways that would be messy and loud and absolutely everything that Ruggiero had told them not to create. The decision took approximately 2 seconds. Carlo Gambino had ordered McBratney killed. Angelo Ruggiero had given Gotti the assignment, failing to complete the assignment because the target wouldn't cooperate with the original plan wasn't acceptable. Failing meant going back to the Ravenite and reporting that McBratney had refused to come outside, that the hit couldn't be completed without creating complications, that Gotti wasn't capable of following through on the assignment he'd been given. Gotti pulled his gun, a .38 revolver that he'd carried in his waistband beneath his jacket, and the sound of the weapon being drawn was somehow audible even over the jukebox and the crowd noise, was a sound that cut through everything else in the bar because it was fundamentally different from any other sound present, was the sound of metal moving against metal in ways that everyone who'd ever been in a situation where guns were drawn recognized instantly. Caiola and Mastropieri drew their weapons simultaneously, the 3 guns appearing in the crowded bar like objects that had materialized from thin air, that created instant transformation of the Friday night atmosphere from drinking and socializing to absolute frozen terror. That made every person in Skeely's tavern understand in the space of one heartbeat that something terrible was about to happen and that they were trapped inside it. The bar went silent. Not the kind of silence that followed arguments or confrontations, but the kind of silence that followed the appearance of weapons in spaces where weapons weren't supposed to be. The kind of silence that came from 60 people simultaneously holding their breath because they understood that movement or noise might cause guns to fire, and that guns firing in enclosed spaces meant people dying. McBratney turned around, his face now showing absolute sobriety. the bourbon haze gone completely, replaced by the particular clarity that fear provided when fear was sufficient to override everything else, including alcohol. When survival instinct engaged at levels that cut through any chemical impairment and brought the mind to focus on the immediate threat to physical existence. "What the fuck is this?" McBratney said, his voice steady, despite the gun pointed directly at his chest from 6 feet away, his expression showing the particular combination of anger and calculation that characterized criminals when they were confronted with situations they hadn't anticipated, situations that required immediate assessment of options that might preserve life. "James McBratney," Gotti said, his voice carrying authority that went beyond what his age or his rank within the Gambino family would normally have justified. Authority that came from holding a gun, and from knowing exactly why he was holding it, and from understanding that this moment was defining. That everything that came next would establish who John Gotti was, and would determine whether he became someone that organized crime remembered, or someone who disappeared into the background of irrelevant criminals who'd never proven themselves when it mattered. "Carlo, Gambino sends his regards." The name hit McBratney like physical blow. The bourbon-fueled confidence that had allowed him to refuse Gotti's request to come outside. The casual dismissal he'd attempted just seconds before. All of it evaporated instantly as the implication of Carlo Gambino's name registered, as McBratney understood what was actually happening, who had actually ordered this encounter, and why. "Listen," McBratney said, his hands now rising in the universal gesture of someone who was trying to buy time, trying to create space for negotiation in a situation that probably didn't allow for negotiation. "Listen, I can explain. The money, I'll give it back. All of it. With interest. With extra. Whatever Carlo wants. I made a mistake. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know who the kid was when I..." Gotti didn't let him finish. Didn't let the explanation develop beyond the first few words. Because every word McBratney spoke was a word that delayed what needed to happen. Was a word that gave the 60 people watching time to memorize faces and details. Was a word that made this already compromised. Hit more compromised. Gotti pulled the trigger. The .38 fired with a sound that was enormous in the enclosed space of the bar, a sound that seemed to compress the air and to shake the windows and to create physical sensation of pressure that everyone present felt in their chests, that was so loud and so sudden that several people screamed despite the shock-induced paralysis that had held them motionless moments before. The first shot hit McBratney in the chest, staggering him backward, his expression shifting from terror to shock as the bullet entered his body, and as the pain that the bullet carried registered with a delay that was characteristic of gunshot wounds. The initial impact felt more like being hit with something heavy than like being shot, and it was only seconds later that the actual damage became apparent. McBratney didn't fall. Staggered, yes. Stumbled backward against a table that collapsed under his weight. But didn't fall, didn't go down, his body responding to the instinct to stay upright that some people possessed even when their bodies were being destroyed, when survive was no longer possible, but the refusal to die easily was still operating. Gotti fired again, second shot, then third. Caiola and Mastropieri fired simultaneously. Caiola twice, Mastropieri always. The combined firepower creating sequence of explosions in the enclosed space that were overwhelming in their volume and in their violence, that turned the corner of Skeely's Tavern into something that looked and sounded like war zone rather than like Friday night bar. McBratney went down after the fourth or fifth shot. Nobody present would be completely certain which shot actually dropped him, because the sounds and the chaos and the adrenaline and the terror made precise recollection impossible, made the sequence of events blur into impression rather than detailed memory. He fell against the floor, his body now showing the kind of damage that gunshots created when multiple rounds struck the same general area, when the human body received more trauma than it could absorb and began shutting down in ways that were visible and final. The entire sequence, from Gotti drawing his weapon to McBratney hitting the floor, lasted approximately 7 seconds. 7 seconds that contained more violence than most people encountered in entire lifetimes. 7 seconds that occurred in front of 60 witnesses who were now screaming or crying or diving behind furniture or pressing against walls trying to get as far from the shooting as physically possible within the confined space. Gotti looked at McBratney's body on the floor, looked at the blood that was spreading across the worn wooden floorboards with the particular speed and volume that arterial bleeding produced, looked at the 60 people who were staring at him with expressions of absolute horror and absolute terror, understood that everything about this hit had gone wrong in terms of professional execution, but had gone completely right in terms of result. James McBratney was dead. Carlo Gambino's order had been fulfilled, and the man who had fulfilled that order had demonstrated something fundamental about his character and his willingness. "We're leaving," Gotti said to Caiola and Mastropieri, his voice flat and businesslike, showing none of the adrenaline or the emotion that such a violent act typically generated, showing instead the particular calm that characterized people who'd just crossed a line and who understood that crossing that line meant they could never go back. The three men walked toward the door of Skeely's Tavern, pushed through the crowd of terrified patrons who parted for them instinctively, walked out into the Staten Island night, where the sounds of the bar, the screaming, the chaos, the wail of someone who'd been hit by ricocheting debris faded behind them as they moved toward the car that would take them back to Queens. Nobody attempted to stop them. Nobody even tried. The 60 people in Skeely's Tavern had just watched 3 men with guns shoot another man to death on the floor of their Friday night drinking establishment. And the only thought any of them had was how to survive the experience, how to process what they'd witnessed, how to look at a dead man's body on a bar floor without the image destroying something fundamental in their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The police arrived at Skeely's Tavern at 10:03 p.m., approximately 16 minutes after the shooting, responding to multiple 911 calls that had been placed by patrons who'd fled the bar after Gotti and his companions left. The scene they arrived to was exactly what the witnesses described: a dead man on the floor of a crowded bar, shot multiple times, killed in front of dozens of people by 3 men who'd walked in, pulled weapons, and executed him with a speed and a decisiveness that suggested this wasn't random violence, but was instead organized murder, carried out according to specific instructions. The investigation that followed was extensive, but ultimately fruitless in terms of prosecuting anyone for the killing. The witnesses cooperated initially, provided descriptions of the 3 shooters, gave accounts of what they'd seen and heard. But as the investigation progressed, as the NYPD began to understand that the murder had been ordered by Carlo Gambino and executed by Gambino family soldiers, the witnesses began to change their stories, began to forget details they'd initially provided, began to develop convenient amnesia about the faces and the voices and the specific actions they'd described in their initial statements. This wasn't unusual in cases involving organized crime. Witnesses to mob murders understood, either through explicit threat or through implicit understanding of how things worked, that cooperating with police investigations into organized crime activities carried risks that exceeded whatever protection the justice system could provide. The Gambino family wasn't going to prosecute witnesses, but the family also wasn't going to forget who had talked and who had helped police. And the potential consequences of cooperation were severe enough that most witnesses chose silence over testimony. John Gotti was arrested on suspicion of involvement in McBratney's murder, was held for questioning, was eventually charged based on witness statements that existed in initial police reports. But the case collapsed when witnesses recanted or became unavailable, when the evidence that existed on paper couldn't be corroborated by people willing to testify under oath, when the prosecution understood that they couldn't convict 3 Gambino soldiers in a murder case, where 60 witnesses had collectively decided that they hadn't actually seen anything that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Gotti was acquitted, walked out of the courtroom a free man, walked out understanding that he'd just been given the most important gift that organized crime could give someone: proof that the family would protect its members from legal consequences even when those members had committed murder in public, in front of dozens of witnesses, in ways that any normal criminal justice system should have been able to prosecute successfully. But more importantly than the acquittal, more significant than the legal outcome, was what happened within the Gambino family itself as a result of the McBratney hit. Carlo Gambino learned that John Gotti had fulfilled the assignment, had killed McBratney personally, rather than hiring someone else to do the actual shooting, had taken extreme risk by executing the hit in a crowded bar rather than finding safer location, had demonstrated willingness to do exactly what was asked, regardless of the complications involved. Carlo Gambino, who was now in final year of his life, who was beginning to think about succession and about who would lead the Gambino family after his death, made a note of John Gotti's name. Not immediately as potential boss. Gotti was still young, still relatively junior, still had years of development ahead of him before he'd be ready for that kind of responsibility. But as someone worth watching, worth cultivating, worth investing in, because The McBratney hit had revealed something about Gotti's character that couldn't be taught or manufactured. The willingness to do what needed to be done, personally, without hesitation, even when doing it meant creating chaos and complications and risk that more cautious soldiers would have refused to accept. The McBratney hit became the foundation of John Gotti's reputation within the Gambino family, became the story that was told when people asked how Gotti had risen from ordinary soldier to eventual boss, became the first chapter of a legend that would eventually include murder of Paul Castellano, survival of Chin Gigante's assassination attempt, systematic prison corruption, and all the other events that made Gotti the most famous mob boss in American history. But it all started in Skeely's Tavern on a Friday night in June 1973. It all started with 60 people watching a 33-year-old man pull a gun on someone who'd kidnapped Carlo Gambino's nephew and shooting that man 6 times on the floor of a Staten Island bar in front of everyone present and walking out into the night as calmly as if he'd just finished a drink rather than finished a life. Friday night, June 2nd, 1973. Skeely's Tavern on Richmond Terrace. The bar that was full when John Gotti walked in, and that would never feel safe again after he left. The 7 seconds of gunfire that changed everything. The 60 witnesses who saw everything and eventually testified about nothing. The dead man on the floor who'd made the mistake of kidnapping the wrong person's nephew. The night that made John Gotti, not through sophistication or through strategic brilliance, or through the kind of calculated intelligence that would later characterize his leadership of the Gambino family, but through something more basic, more fundamental, more necessary in the world of organized crime: the willingness to pull the trigger personally, publicly, messily, in front of everyone, because Carlo Gambino had asked him to, and because John Gotti understood that the asking was the opportunity, and that the only acceptable response was yes. That was the night. That was the hit. That was when a Gambino soldier became something more than a soldier, became someone that the most powerful criminal organization in America recognized as worth watching, worth protecting, worth investing in, because he'd demonstrated that night in a Staten Island bar that he was willing to do whatever was necessary, regardless of how messy or how public or how dangerous the doing of it might be. 7 seconds of gunfire, 60 witnesses who saw everything, 1 dead man on the floor, 1 young man walking out into the night with blood on his hands and with a future that none of them could have imagined. June 2nd, 1973. The night James McBratney died for kidnapping the wrong person. The night John Gotti proved he was willing to kill for Carlo Gambino in public, in chaos, in front of everyone. The night that started everything that came after.